What if I told you the Confederate government actually prohibited ending slavery? That the nation founded to protect states' autonomy stripped Southern states of the right to abolish slavery themselves? For more than a century and a half, popular myths have blurred the real causes of the Civil War, dressing up the Confederacy's determination to defend slavery as a constitutional principle. But consider a starker possibility, a Confederacy that embedded slavery so firmly in its laws that any attempt to dismantle it was outlawed. And what about the persistent claim that black men served as Confederate soldiers? Truth or fabrication? Stay with me as we expose 7 Civil War falsehoods that force us to rethink what we thought we knew about the Confederacy, slavery, and the conflict that tore this nation apart. This is not mere history, it's revelation. Before we dive in, please like and subscribe to the channel to support our work and the community. Supporters of Southern secession have long framed the Confederacy's founding as a constitutional defense of states' rights, arguing that secession was a reaction to perceived federal encroachment rather than a fight to preserve slavery. They maintain the Union threatened Southern institutions and that the secessionists were protecting state sovereignty from Northern interference. It's true that, at the time the Southern states were leaving the Union, no federal statute had been passed to abolish slavery outright, and Abraham Lincoln publicly denied plans to emancipate enslaved people immediately. Yet leaders in the Deep South, South Carolina first among them, viewed Lincoln's 1860 election as intolerable. They chose secession over accepting the result of a Democratic vote, and their official declarations made plainly clear that the preservation of slavery was their central motive. As additional slaveholding states withdrew, they established a single national government, the Confederate States of America. That Constitution created a federal system, but contrived to restrain states in key ways. It regulated tariffs, centralized currency powers, and even limited state authority over the international slave trade. Crucially, it included provisions to prevent any laws that would interfere with slave ownership, forbidding retrospective laws or measures that would undermine the property claims of enslavers. By elevating slavery to federal protection, the Confederacy removed the option for member states to legislate against or abolish bondage on their own. That fact stands in stark contradiction to the states' rights motif often invoked as the war's central cause. It also overlooks the South's prior efforts to limit Northern state autonomy, a reminder that appeals to sovereignty were sometimes selective and strategically employed long before 1860. The origins of the sanitized narrative are complex, but it rose to prominence well after the war. Meanwhile, the idea that black men widely served as Confederate combat soldiers has little substantiation. On the contrary, abundant evidence contradicts it. The Confederate government explicitly barred black enlistment as regular combat troops, instead employing black people, whether free or enslaved, largely for labor duties. These conscripted roles included manual field work, cooking, hauling supplies, and tending animals, generally performed under armed white supervision. Enslaved people were also pressed into wartime industries, mines, railroads, and factories. Coerced labor had long underpinned the Southern economy, and enslavers often leased out enslaved labor and kept most or all of the resulting wages. Occasionally, an enslaved person might retain a portion of pay, but that was the exception. Throughout the war, Confederate legislators debated proposals to arm black men, yet they repeatedly rejected such measures until March 1865, mere weeks before Lee's surrender. Even that late enactment met fierce resistance. Notable figures like Robert Toombs, former Confederate Secretary of State and critic of arming black troops, denounced the idea as ruinous to Southern honor and strength. In a June 1865 essay, he argued that integrating black regiments with the Army of Northern Virginia would degrade the force, though by then that army had already dissolved. After the first 7 states seceded, the Confederate government in Montgomery demanded that state militias cede control to central authority. Military command, including volunteers and integrated militia units, came under President Jefferson Davis's direction. Both Union and Confederate forces initially relied heavily on volunteers to fill their ranks and to staff navies. But volunteerism could not meet the Confederacy's increasing manpower demands. By April 1862, Confederate leaders acknowledged voluntary enlistments alone were insufficient. That month, they enacted the first national conscription law in United States history, instituting a draft to maintain their army's strength. The law angered many. Initially, it targeted men aged 18 to 35, but exempted those in essential wartime occupations, and tellingly, men who owned 20 or more enslaved persons. The rationale was that such men were needed to oversee enslaved labor, a recognition that slavery itself was treated as vital to the wartime economy. By 1864, the draft expanded dramatically, at times stretching from ages 17 to 70. Provisions permitting the hiring of substitutes, also used in the North, allowed wealthier men to avoid service, fueling perceptions of class-based injustice. While volunteers still made up many soldiers on both sides, conscription spurred legal challenges, political backlash, and civil unrest. Draft riots in New York City and other northern urban areas showed how unpopular compulsory service could be. The South saw its own waves of resistance. Opposition to enforced enlistment persisted until the Confederate system ultimately collapsed. After the first secessions, other Southern states hesitated while debate and pressure mounted. South Carolina, as the first to depart the Union, was particularly insistent. Its leaders demanded federal authorities abandon control of military installations on their soil, especially Fort Sumter, which guarded Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter's defense network included Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island nearby. On March 4, 1861, President Lincoln stated in his inaugural address that he had no intention of invading the states that had seceded or interfering with slavery where it already existed. He affirmed the federal government's duty to collect tariffs in southern ports and to maintain control over federal forts within secessionist territory. Secretary of State William Seward tried informal negotiations with Southern figures in hopes of a peaceful settlement, but those efforts came to nothing. In Charleston, Union Major Robert Anderson withdrew from Fort Moultrie to the more defensible Fort Sumter. When the federal government announced plans to resupply Sumter by sea, Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered its capture, precipitating hostilities. Anderson refused to surrender outright and sought further negotiation, but Confederate forces ultimately bombarded Fort Sumter for 2 days until it yielded. The fort's fall, along with seizures of federal properties in places like Missouri, prompted Lincoln to call for 90-day volunteers to reclaim the occupied posts. Those moves swayed several undecided states, Virginia among them, to reconsider their position on secession. Earlier legislative votes in Virginia had rejected withdrawal, but the unfolding crisis rekindled debate. Most states that seceded in 1860 to 1861 later rejoined the Union with their pre-war boundaries intact. Virginia was the notable exception. Unlike states in the Deep South, where secession had broader public backing, Virginia's populace initially opposed leaving the Union. That shifted after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's troop call. Delegates from already seceded states campaigned vigorously at the Virginia Convention to bring the state into the Confederacy. Lincoln's call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion further swayed sentiment toward disunion. Still, pockets of strong Unionist feeling persisted, particularly in the mountainous western counties. Representatives from those regions convened in Wheeling and began organizing to separate from Virginia. By spring 1861, they established a reorganized state government loyal to the Union, which the U.S. government recognized, and which sent 2 senators representing the western districts. As a result, Virginia effectively had 2 competing governments, one Confederate, one Unionist. In May 1862, the Wheeling government approved forming a new state from western counties, and Congress admitted West Virginia in 1863, with the condition that it abolish slavery. Virginia thus lost its Northwest Territory and, notably, the Arlington estate, once owned by Robert E. Lee. That property later became federal land and was designated Arlington National Cemetery. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia launched two major invasions into the North. In 1862, after a decisive win at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee moved into Maryland, a slave state with conflicted loyalties. His aims included stirring local support, disrupting Union control, and relieving war-weary Virginia farms that had been heavily taxed to supply Confederate armies. Maryland offered logistical resources, but Lee's army risked alienating civilians by seizing supplies or by capturing black people encountered along the march. The campaign faltered after Lee's defeat at Antietam in September 1862. Although his forces retreated in good order after the bloodiest single day in American history, the invasion gained little strategic advantage. In 1863, following success at Chancellorsville, Lee launched a second campaign into Pennsylvania. He sought to replenish supplies, undermine Northern morale by threatening cities like Washington and Baltimore, and disrupt the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a target he had identified earlier. Contrary to some claims, his goal was not a massive slave-forcing raid, although Confederate troops did capture free and escaped black persons during the advance. Months earlier, in March 1863, Confederate authorities decreed that captured black people, whether free or enslaved, were to be sent to Richmond for forced labor. That policy contributes to portrayals of the Gettysburg Campaign as a large-scale slave raid designed to support Confederate logistics. Yet this narrative clashes with Virginia's legal and personal histories. Consider Robert E. Lee's own position. In 1857, after the death of his father-in-law George Washington Parke Custis, Lee's wife inherited the Arlington estate, other lands, and some 189 enslaved individuals. Custis's will specified that these enslaved people were to be freed within 5 years of his death. Lee, as executor, faced heavy debts. He temporarily left military service to manage Arlington himself, undertaking legal measures that delayed emancipation. Lee sold enslaved people to pay creditors, resulting in the breakup of nearly all the families he had inherited, with only one family spared intact. Those enslaved resisted, insisting on the freedom promised in the will. Lee recorded the difficulties he faced, imprisoning some, hiring out others to distant employers, and offering rewards for those who fled. He tried to keep them in bondage for the full 5-year period, and arguably longer. While the allegation that he personally whipped an enslaved person is disputed among historians, Lee did authorize corporal punishment in some instances. Lee described slavery as a greater evil for white society than for black people, testifying after the war to a congressional committee that black people lacked a natural propensity to work. He also expressed hopes that Virginia might expel its black population after emancipation, essentially denying the possibility of true racial equality. So what do these facts mean for how we remember the Civil War and the Confederacy's legacy? Was the conflict really driven by states' rights, or was that a post-war story crafted to obscure the South's legal entrenchment of slavery? And if the Confederacy prohibited any effort to eliminate slavery, what does that say about the myths still circulated today? The truth is more complicated and far more disquieting than many prefer to admit. History is not mere dates and battle maps. It's about which stories we elevate and which we bury. Now I want to hear from you. What surprised you most? Which of these 7 misconceptions challenged your view of the Civil War? How does this change the way we discuss America's past and its future? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's open a conversation that goes deeper than surface narratives, because understanding the fuller story is the first step toward real change. If this investigation into the Civil War resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share. And join us for more episodes that dig beneath the familiar versions of history.